After Nigeria's Bureau of Statistics released the inflation rate for the month of January, the Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC of the CBN, decided to retain the benchmark monetary policy rate, that's the MPR, at 27.25%. What does this mean for consumers and businesses, and what is the future trajectory for lending rates? Babajide Ogusawo, founder of Leadership by Data and Channels Television's data analyst, is right here to share more analysis, insights, and of course intelligence about the decision of the CBN, that's the Central Bank of Nigeria, and Nigeria's changing macroeconomic indicators. Babajide, great to have you again on the News at 10.
Good evening, Ayotunde.
All right, so we're looking at the National Bureau of Statistics, the new methodology we've been told for calculating the inflation rate, which puts it at 24.48%. That's Nigeria's annual inflation. Now, the CBN retained its monetary policy at 27.25%. How does this really affect, the common man, and how are investors reacting?
Before we start going into the analysis of how does this affect the common man, how are investors reacting, you talked about it, the inflation rate 24.8%, but it's important to be clear about what it is. It is the average annual inflation rate.
Average annual.
An average could be deceitful. And I'll try and see if you can work this out. You see, in a class of 10 students, 6 out of these 10 students in an exam scored 40%. So, class of 10 students, 6 out of these 10 students in an exam scored 40%. The remaining 4 students scored 100%, Ayotunde. So try and work it out. What is the average score in that class?
So that's going to take, it's going to take a while for me to get that correctly.
Yeah. But just try and work it out. So 6 students in a class of 10, 6 scored 40%, 4 students scored 100%. What's the average score in that class?
Should be somewhere 64%.
That's correct, 64%. Now, even though the majority of students, 6 students failed, 40%, however, 4 students created an illusion that the average score mathematically became 64%. And so, yes, you're right, average score in a class of 10, 64%, even though the majority failed the test. And that is really one of the pitfalls of using averages. You need to understand that inflation, based on even this new methodology, like previous methodologies, relies on a basket of goods and then an average is found. However, if some products on that average are skewed, then the numbers will be deceitful. Yes, like you said, the average is 64%, but does that really reflect what happened in that exam? Tonight, based on this inflation rate and what the CBN has done, there's some good news and there's some bad news. Now, the good news is, yes, based on this updated methodology, we've seen inflation compared to January 2024 is much better based on this new methodology. The good news for President Tinubu is that 24% inflation rate that we have now is about what it was about 60 days after it was sworn in May 2023. So as of July 2023, inflation was 24%. So clearly, this sort of numbers gives the president a second chance to get his policies and his performance right. So that is the good news. The bad news, however, is one of the reasons, even though it's not public, why such moves about rebasing is done is because of how it will make the country look good. Let's take a look at, for instance, how has foreign direct investment flown into the country? Because that's the question. Will this new rebasing of CPI and new numbers of GDP that we're expecting assist with FDI? These are the facts. The first half of 2019, FDI to Nigeria, $471 million. 2020, the first half, $363 million. 2022, $302 million. Even though those numbers were still largely believed to be grossly insufficient based on the sort of inflow that Nigeria requires. Look at what happened in the last 2 years. First half of 2023, only $134 million. First half of last year, only $149 million. In summary, the last 2 years in Nigeria have been the worst for FDI within this decade.
So we're really running out of time, Babajide, but of course, looking at the lower monetary policy rate, that's the MPR, we know that it is critical, of course, for banks to start lowering their lending rate for businesses. What does the future really hold, for Nigeria at this point?
It depends on how we want to look at it. I remember when the last time the Central Bank of Nigeria had a single-digit monetary policy rate was in September 2011. I think that was 14 years ago. President Jonathan then was just 54 years old. The question is, will it take us another 14 years to get to single-digit MPR? Let's even take a look at what has happened within this decade, and let's look at our MPR, because it really reflects how easy banks will be able to provide the sort of competitive lending rates to grow the economy. But before that, again, within this report, it talks about how do Nigerians spend their money. Clearly, this report allows us to see that things are really still primitive. More than half of what people spend their money on in Nigeria today is still on food and non-alcoholic drinks, money spent on restaurants. So largely, this report also really says that the Nigerian economy is primitive. People really use almost all of their money on these essential services, food, non-alcoholic beverages, transport, but largely what is taking a lot of money from Nigerians is food. Look at how much Nigerians spend on items such as household maintenance, just about 3%. Money spent on information and communication, just about 3%. So largely, we still have a challenge of how we will convert a primitive economy to a modern economy.
Indeed, the government has its work cut out for it, but we thank you so much, Babajide Ogunsanwo, for your analysis as always.
The pleasure is all mine today.